Now, the campaigners who won the Supreme Court battle over the legal definition of a woman say they've received death threats and misogynistic abuse since the landmark judgment. On Wednesday, 5 judges sided with the campaign group For Women Scotland, which argued that single-sex spaces and protections should apply only to people who are born female. Well, just before we came on air, I spoke to Susan Smith, the director of For Women Scotland, and she told me how she felt on the moment she heard the Supreme Court's judgment.
It was incredible. We hadn't had any indication of the ruling. I know a lot of people thought that we knew when we walked in there, but we really, really didn't have any idea. It could have been very different. So there was relief. I think the moment that the judge started talking about their opinion was that sex meant biological sex, I think then we thought we'd won, but I was still waiting for a but at that point. So I was still holding my breath until the moment he said that they'd allowed the appeal. And then when he read out the list of reasons, it was so comprehensive and it covered everything that we've been talking about.
And it's been such a long political and legal battle. Did you all go and celebrate afterwards? We all saw you outside the court. Did you go and celebrate afterwards?
Yes, although immediately afterwards we went to do some press, and or I did. I think Mariam probably went to celebrate. I did some immediate response stuff, and then we went to find some food, and a few of us then had a drinks. One of the women had very wonderfully organised an event for us, so we were able to go and enjoy that.
Now, tell us what's happened since then, because the Sunday Times today talks about the scale of the abuse, the backlash that you've received.
I mean, the important thing to stress is that most of the messages that we have had have been lovely. You know, a lot of people saying how much it's meant to them and how they have struggled and incidents that have happened to them. But there is no doubt that there is a very angry, very aggressive minority of people who have been sending the most horrible things. And some of them, frankly, are just old-style misogynist, sexist idiots. And I think they see this as an excuse to be abusive to women. And you saw some of that in the protests, with threats to bring back witch burning or to hang TERFs and all this sort of thing. I don't think any of those signs have any place in a legitimate protest. And we would never entertain anyone bringing things like that along. And some of the speeches as well were incendiary.
Tell us a bit more about some of the sorts of abusive messages that you have received.
Well, there are the people who just, roll out all the offensive words they can think of, which I wouldn't want to repeat on air, but they are classic abusive terms hurled at women and personal abuse. I think the really sad ones are those that have come from people who have genuinely been misled by some of the people in organisations that are supposed to be looking out for them, who have been persuaded that just ordinary mums are out to get them and to murder them. And that's hard to take, because that's abuse from people who are angry and threatening because they think that you really are the devil incarnate, and that's harder to take.
And how difficult has that been for you personally?
I think you get inured to it. We've had it for a very long time. I hope people who know me personally know that I am not a horrible individual, and that there is nuance in my personal opinions, and that I'm very tolerant of how people individually choose to live their lives. I just have an opinion that the law needs to be based on reality rather than fiction.
And you mentioned things like the march that we saw in London. There was also one in Scotland yesterday. Do you understand the anger of some of those campaigners who do clearly feel quite threatened by this?
I do, to an extent, but I think it's misdirected. We always believed this was the law, and we simply sought clarification. And the problem was that organisations which had been misdirecting government, especially about the law, and had been in places like the NHS and schools and had been peddling this false narrative in order to change the law by stealth. And they had persuaded people that they had the right to walk into any facility for the opposite sex and no one would stop them. And in fact, women rarely would stop men walking into their space because we're scared. So I think they should be angry with those people. And I think they should be angry with the government, because if they'd have listened to us and had a reasonable conversation 7 or 8 years ago, we wouldn't be in this position. We wouldn't have had to be in this position. I don't think we'd even have got the support to get this far if they'd have been a bit more reasonable in their approach. But their anger is frightening, because their anger is... some of them yesterday were sounding very much like the most thwarted, abusive men. Somebody made the analogy that it's like the most dangerous time for a woman is when she leaves an abusive relationship. And it almost feels that that is the anger they're channeling. So it does concern me that we're a bit more our faces are probably a bit better known now, because some of these people are scary.
So you clearly feel that the government should have addressed this some time ago. Now we have got that ruling and it was pretty clear. What does the government need to do now, given that it is facing something of a backlash, but the judgment, the legal ruling, makes it clear that quite a few things are going to have to change?
I think in terms of the Scottish government, they need to pull things like the school guidance, which is, that was plainly unlawful even before we took this judicial review, because we'd already established that self-ID was not lawful with our first one. So that guidance should have been knocked out ages ago, and they dogmatically clung to it. Similarly, some of those NHS policies, they're also based on self-ID. So all these things need to be ripped up. The government needs to start providing clear guidance. And I think actually in terms of the Westminster government, we need to see a lead on the fact that it is not acceptable in a campaign to be abusive about people, and maybe tell some of the MPs and MSPs to tone down their rhetoric as well. We had an MSP yesterday, was at one of the protests at Aberdeen, while a man was shouting that women were bitches. That's the word he was using. And he was also encouraging people to urinate on them. So, and I don't know why an MSP stood there and listened to that, because that's horrible stuff. So I think we need a lead from John Swinney and Keir Starmer saying that conversations, yes, but not abuse. And they also need to think about if there are issues, because we know that gender reassignment is still a protected characteristic, as it always was under the Equality Act, that people are safe from harassment and discrimination. And if there are facilities that organisations representing those people think they need that do not involve destroying women's services, then I'm sure everybody would be very happy to have that conversation. But they need to channel it into something much more positive now.
So given all of that, do you feel now that your campaign is over, that it's achieved what it needed to achieve, or do you feel that you personally still have more to do?
It would be very nice to have a break, but I think that the response is going to be to try to mitigate what we've achieved and what we've clarified, and try to introduce more confusion yet again. We know that obviously there's been the very angry response, but also the Scottish government-funded lobby groups are very resistant and are trying to think of political measures, I suppose, to undermine this. They will, I imagine, be seeking to amend the Equality Act. I don't know how much political will there will be for that. But I'm especially disappointed with things like the Scottish Government's funded supposed feminist group Engender, who put out a lengthy statement saying that this did not accord with feminism, which is absolutely mad because, of course, if you can't define women, you can't define and protect women in law.
So your campaigning will continue?
Absolutely.
Well, that was Susan Smith, the director of For Women Scotland, speaking to me just a little earlier here on Times Radio.